and I think there is no better way to, keep this inspiration. Um Introducing a keynote by Francesca Helm. Francesca is one of the, let's say, person more engaged and passionate about the themes we will be discussing today. I can tell you because although we are not exactly in the same discipline, I think I've been, say, running to Francesca a number of times because she's a professor of English, but in a social science, a big department in Padua, in Padua, which is one of our partner universities, and in my personal, let's say, little experience, one of the, say, references in the Italian social science reality. Then I think I met several times because of the Coimbra group, because she has been engaged with the innovation education working group, and she has been the promoter of a number of activities there. She has been, and she's still member of the board of Uni Collaboration, which is one of our partners here. I think she had a role in the monitoring of the first round of so-called EVE, Erasmus Virtual Exchange, which was a sort of experimentation a few years ago. And then she, of course, continued with this. And more recently, she started a number of collaboration in the field, including, let's say, sort of very friendly collaboration with this network, and we thank you, Francesca, for being here in this important event of this. But one thing I want to stress before leaving the floor to Francesca, that Francesca is also extremely passionate and committed to the applicability of this. And this recalls very much what Marcel was saying before. One thing and another opportunity I had to work, or at least to see Francesca from time to time, was Scholar at Risk. Francesca is the coordinator of the Italian unit. Actually, Siena and Padua were among the founders, and we found in Padua a few years ago, I think it was now 5 years ago. And Francesca is the promoter of together with a couple of other very, very good colleagues of the Scholar at Risk. I think this is crucial because we don't have to think to our technical role in the field of innovation in the field of teaching without having an anchorage to the applicability and to the possibility to let our mission traveling together with our teaching staff and students. And our missions are not only the hubris of the research, the metis of the teaching, but even the pietas of the third mission and the public engagement. We are in something which is larger than our universities. That's why I think that Francesca did a terrific job in keeping together innovation and applicability to the society. I think that that's let's say a nice story for the future generation of academic, and I think that we are curious about listening from her what is the state of play in this long travel of these different missions together. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you, Luca, for this presentation. I don't think I've ever had a presentation like this before. I'm honored to be here, so thank you. Thank you also, Marcello and Professor Borghesi and Di Pietra for this introduction. I'm just going to get my presentation. A second. Okay. Okay, so as I said, thank you very much for inviting me to be keynote speaker at this event. And I've been following the Frames project with great interest, and I'm really impressed at the work that you've been doing. So I'm going to start by looking at the past and my version of how and why we've got to where we are today with regard to virtual exchange, and then considerations as to how we might move forward. And so I'm speaking here as a teacher, researcher, virtual exchange practitioner located in a European context. And I think it's important to specify always where it is that we're speaking from. Sorry. Share the screen. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I can carry on talking anyway. Yes, so I'm speaking from a European standpoint with some experience of both the policy and the higher education contexts here in Europe. Luckily, the history of virtual exchange is rather short. So it started when internet became accessible, though, of course, we've had, pedagogic practices like, I remember Marcello talking about pen pals. So this kind of exchange has been happening for a long time. But virtual exchange started with the internet, and it was embraced by a small number of enthusiasts, many like myself in language education, where we called it telecollaboration. Dialogic practices of virtual exchange were emerging in peace building. So the Solia project started in 2003 in the wake of 9/11. There were global nomads group, ION in the US. And then in the field of business and economics, it also began to emerge in the early 2000s. And I think then what was surprising to some of us was actually how slow it was to grow. Why didn't everybody just jump on board? It really kind of made so much sense to us that nobody was listening. So a lot of the time at the beginning, we spent actually trying to spread the word and convert more people to do virtual exchange. We wanted to mainstream this activity so all students could have this kind of experience and make the world a smaller, more friendly, curious, peaceful, and connected space. I remember the Virtual Exchange Coalition being set up. I can't remember exactly the dates, but seeking to get virtual exchange providers and practitioners to join forces so we could persuade funders to support this activity. And I remember going to some lobbying and networking meetings in Brussels, a whole new world to me. I really didn't know much about this kind of activity. And there was a lot of resistance, I learned. There was a lot of resistance, above all, from organizations involved in study abroad and international education. A kind of pushback and limited understanding of the potential of online education and the different kinds of online education. I remember the excitement, but also the kind of trepidation at hearing that the US State Department was probably going to fund a specific program, which became the Stevens Initiative. And this was launched in 2015, and they've become one of the biggest supporters of virtual exchange, providing funding for a range of different virtual exchange models at school and higher education level. And of course, virtual exchange is a form of soft power, right? So, and it comes at a much lower cost than international study programs. And so at a time when the kind of perceived threat of Islamic terrorism was high, there was a strong interest in engaging with the Middle East and North Africa. The Stevens Initiative, that was the target area. Now it's continued, though, to fund virtual exchange. It funds research into virtual exchange, and it's expanding into other areas. So they recently announced that they're moving into Mexico that they're supporting collaborations with Mexico and Ukraine. A short time after that, there was, Marcello mentioned, the Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange Project. So the European Commission published they funded a feasibility study before launching the Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange Project. And this is when we met in Brussels, I think at the launch of the project. I can see a young Casper there, and Waidehi. And this was our meeting. And I think it was when, just after they were celebrating 30 years of the Erasmus Mobility Program. And so we started this project with Unimed, Solia, Sharing Perspectives Foundation, Anna Lind, Search for Common Ground. So it was a huge project piloting 4 different models of virtual exchange between European and Southern Mediterranean countries. And at the same time, the Evolve project also started, and that too was about mainstreaming virtual exchange. And an initial starting point of that project was to investigate the awareness and use of virtual exchange in Europe through a baseline study. And I remember one of the results we found that there was some kind of awareness of virtual exchange, but not really that much practice going on. And so again, this idea of mainstreaming virtual exchange. And then there was also the Evaluate project, which was about mainstreaming virtual exchange in teacher education. So for students who were then going to be teaching in the schools. And I had the privilege of working on the monitoring and evaluation of the Erasmus Virtual Exchange project. And looking back now at the results, so after a few years have passed and I've digested various things, some things stand out which were perhaps not so salient at the time, and perhaps we didn't emphasize enough. I think it's important that it's one of the few studies that actually compares different models of virtual exchange using the same tools with a considerable level of detail. I think one of the really impressive things is the size, the number of participants we involved. So the target of the Commission was 25,000 participants. We actually involved 28,000. And what I think is really important is the balance, right? So we have 50% European, 50% Southern Mediterranean countries. And I know we're not comparing virtual exchange to mobility, but I think this is certainly very different to mobility flows. But I think it's also important to look now at the numbers in greater detail. So if you break down the figure of participants, over 23,000 were reached through online facilitated dialogue activities. So there were, we had acronyms then, IUX and the Connect programs. So the majority, 83% of the participants were reached through these ready-made programs, we called them, dialogue-based. And then we had 2,700 were reached in exchanges, the kind of what are commonly known as COIL projects, co-designed exchanges between teachers. So that is 10% of the total population of the projects. And of these projects, there were 71 exchanges implemented in all, but only 7 were Europe South Med. Okay, most of these were actually intra-European projects. There were also debate exchanges set up by Anna Lind Foundation. And again, those were intra-regional. They were mainly amongst Southern Med. So there were few that were South Med Europe. So it took a lot of time to kind of get this exchange. But the majority were reached, as I said, through the large-scale dialogue programs. And I think it's also to say that growth was slow. I remember when we were first launching the project, we were offering free training, we were offering free exchanges, this fantastic experience, for students. And it was as if we were doing kind of some terrible activity. There was reluctance, there was resistance, suspicion, right? It was difficult to get people engaged. So, the growth was slow, but it did happen, right? We involved a lot more people in training than we expected. So this was, it was very positive, but it took time. It took a lot of time and a lot of efforts to engage people. And then something else I think is important is this idea of a leaky pipeline. And here I'm talking about for the co-designed exchanges. So Uni Collaboration was involved in training, professional development for teachers and youth workers so that they could set up their exchanges. And we trained over 1,400 educators and youth workers to develop virtual exchange projects. And the training courses had high completion and satisfaction rates, so they were very positive. And then afterwards, they were particularly positive when COVID struck because they were well prepared. And afterwards, we got a lot of thanks saying, oh, well, you know, the training really prepared us. But the leaky pipeline is from the professional development to the implementation. And there are a lot of kind of holes, right? Where were the leaks? And here, I think we need to look at various factors, but also related to the kind of structure of higher education. Lack of time, changing jobs, precarious teaching conditions, lack of confidence, lack of support, lack of institutional support. So here, I think Frames fills an important gap in supporting, you know, institutions, in supporting educators. Finding partners is also difficult. So I think this is an important, so the training was important, and it continues to be very important, but there are also other things. And from this, one of the recommendations that we made to the Commission in the final report was to include tried and tested models of virtual exchange, okay, so the ready-made models, training programs for educators and youth workers, and opportunities for developing and piloting new formats in future initiatives. And so this was one of the recommendations, also based on what had been learned through the Stevens Initiative, because they had various learning from their projects. Then something else, another significant finding of the project was the different learning outcomes of the models of virtual exchange. So in the monitoring and evaluation, we used pre and post tests, post-exchange self-evaluations, but also interviews and focus groups. The tests were repeated over multiple iterations of the exchanges and repeatedly produced similar results. So the dialogue-based models had a higher effect size in curiosity and self-esteem, and much higher size than other models regarding attitudes to ethnic and religious diversity. So how did we account for these differences and the strong impact of dialogue? One of the most salient themes that emerged in the interviews and focus groups when talking to the student were the responses to the open questions was the diversity amongst the people in the groups with regard not only to geographic origin, but also perspectives on the issues discussed, life experiences, values, and beliefs, right? So that it was the kind of the greater cultural diversity in a sense. Other factors were also the key role of the facilitators. So the dialogue sessions are led by trained facilitators. The intensity of the contact, weekly 2-hour dialogues where you could actually see each other. And these sessions ran for 4 to 9 weeks. So, sorry. Then there's also, and it's pretty obvious, but we don't think about it too much, is the impact of the design of the virtual exchange and how interculturality is conceived, how it's conceptualized. So in task-based and project-based or also challenge-based approaches, which characterize the kind of co-designed exchanges, students generally you would have this information exchange, getting to know each other, perhaps cultural comparisons if you have the kind of bilateral projects. Challenge-based exchanges are where you have students perhaps in more than 2 partners, but working together on a challenge to find a solution to a problem. And here, this tends to prioritize functional interculturality or convergent, right? You need to produce something together. You need to find a solution to a problem, whether it's a joint report, it's a teaching activity. So it's an important skill to learn. We need this in our work. We need to manage difficulties. We need to collaborate and produce some things. We need to be careful also, though, of whose voices are heard, whose are prioritized, and whose differences are suppressed, or who suppresses their own difference because they might not feel strong. On the other hand, non-convergent and more critical interculturality is more easily accessed through dialogue-based exchanges, where there's no need to converge, right? So differences are valued and explored, and there's no need to converge on a final product. So the implications of these kind of results were taken into account during the implementation of the EVE project, because we were already aware of this quite early on. And in the second and third years of the project, we also began to integrate these facilitated dialogue sessions in the co-designed exchanges. So you would find here, I mean, these are my not very good drawings, but you would have a dialogue session here before the exchange, before the collaboration. You would have one midway during the exchange to reflect as a group on how the collaboration was going. And then perhaps you would have one at the end of the project for a debriefing. So what we kind of essentially developed in the EVE project was also the support of co-designed exchanges with dialogue. So it became more spread in the different projects. And so one of the recommendations, the ones in red are the ones that weren't necessarily taken into account by the European Commission. So this is my red alarm, was to ensure that any future virtual exchange initiatives are supported by trained facilitators. And we trained thousands of facilitators in the EVE project. Also to set high standards and quality control for facilitators. So we had a kind of monitoring process of the facilitators. Trained facilitators were supported and had coaches, and there was a system of control and support. And also to grow and nurture the EVE facilitator community, because the idea was that it would carry on after the project. So what happened next after EVE, and where are we now? As we all know, EVE ended in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Did virtual exchange become a mainstream practice? Were the EVE recommendations taken up? To a certain degree. As we all know, the pandemic led to a temporary halt to student mobility. It heightened interest in virtual exchange from international relations offices, mobility providers, government agencies. Sadly, the project ended, as specified in the contract, right at the moment where we were reaching momentum. So participation had begun to take off, interest had really grown, students were making contact and connections with each other through technology, something which didn't happen during the COVID pandemic, right? So if you read the reports post-COVID, there is still this idea, because a lot of it was emergency remote teaching, and students weren't interacting in a lot of cases. So, but from the pandemic, educators have learned to use technology, right? So I think the technological barrier to a degree has overcome. So though EVE ended, the pandemic did lead to a surge of interest in virtual exchange, and we have seen some very important funding projects. So in Germany, the DRRD launched the IVAC program, International Virtual Academic Collaboration, in 2020, and awarded virtual exchange projects up to 50,000 euros each, with over 60 projects a year funded in 2020, 2021, 21, 22, right? And with the funding, it allows virtual exchange teachers, implementers, to employ staff to support them. Then I think there are technical problems in employing the staff. But anyway, the good idea is there. And this is the rationale for funding this project. Then in the Netherlands, and we have a lot of colleagues from the Netherlands here who I'm sure can tell you more about it, there is the VIS project, so Virtual International Collaboration in Higher Education, again, supporting professional development for lecturers and paying for time release. And I'm sure Casper, other people, Unicollaboration can tell you more about this. So we have these funded programs. The European Commission has gone from EVE to Key Action 1, so it has become a core part of the strategy of the Commission. So again, it was taken into consideration. There is virtual exchange in the Erasmus program, and we have the BEEPS, Erasmus Blended Intensive Programs, and you're going to hear about them more later on. So within these programs just mentioned, there are a lot of opportunities and funding for professional development. And Unicollaboration, the organization I collaborate with, actually I'm vice president of, does training courses for individual teachers, for institutions, university alliances. So there was, a growing interest in professional development, and a lot of other organizations now are offering professional development. Okay. So what of the future? So what I see at the moment is that in this increasingly artificial intelligence-driven world, we're humanizing technologies and we're dehumanizing humans. So Marcello talked about the crises that there are in various parts of the world. And it's true, this is what is happening. Humans, so we're interacting with these technologies, and had we invested a bit more in virtual exchange than in artificial intelligence, I really think the world might be a better place now. So this is a question I asked ChatGPT-3. The kind of question that, the kind of thing that I would hope my students would have learned from a virtual exchange on the climate crisis. So how does the climate crisis impact you? And this is the reply I got. As an AI model, I do not have a physical form, so I'm not directly impacted by the climate crisis, and blah, blah, blah. I will let you read it. So you can see you get a kind of a general response. I don't think it's particularly inspiring or moving. It's not going to lead to an emotional or empathetic response from the students. I have heard that ChatGPT-4 is actually much better, and it is being used to groom people into various other activities. Help! So what this highlights to me is the importance of why we do and should continue to do virtual exchange in the future and now, to build and strengthen humanity and interactions and collaborations with people, above all, with people and knowledges that perhaps are even radically different from our own. So back to the question, looking to the future, what do I see? I'm going to start with the pessimistic view, so then I can go on to a more optimistic view. It's great to see much more recognition of and interest in virtual exchange. Until recently, it was a kind of mainly bottom-up activity led by motivated educators, the Cassandras of the world, often off the radar of universities, part of regular class activity. But now with institutional investment and top-down encouragement at both institutional and national levels, I do think that there are some risks. And there are challenges and there are risks. So, I mean, virtual exchange doesn't and won't, and I don't think it necessarily should, involve all teaching staff. So this has always been a problem with COIL and EVE. It was a problem before COVID, and I think it will remain after. And I think now teachers are actually feeling quite exhausted. I think a lot of the pressure from COVID and the kind of care work, the pastoral care, has been on us, and we're actually quite exhausted and tired. We have heavy workloads, large numbers of students, if you teach in Italy, if you teach English. So it's great to see funding initiatives like this and DRRD. But again, it's not like this everywhere. In most of the world, I think virtual exchange might remain an activity for the elite few. So teachers who do have, funding or time release, teachers who are already open to intercultural engagement, people working in internationalization offices who are involved in project development and partnerships. So while I do think it's important to have these national programs and to invest in professional development of educators and doctoral students and future teachers, I think universities should have a broader portfolio of virtual exchange, as one of the things you've suggested also in Frames, which includes funding for ready-made dialogue-based exchanges, because this can amplify the number and diversity of students reached with a quality intercultural experience. And this comes at a cost, right? And it's right that it comes at a cost. There are facilitators, it takes organization. And so why universities in Europe, or perhaps the people making the choices for the universities, have no problems finding money for hardware, for software, for anti-plagiarism, for MOOCs, for learning management systems, why can't they find money to fund virtual exchange programs? Maybe they don't know what they are. Another issue I think that has emerged at various conferences I've been to is that this institutionalization of virtual exchange has led to more demand to be accountable. So paperwork, bureaucratic work for BIPs. I've heard about all the paperwork that you have to do for a BIP, so that it counts towards international numbers. And this will disengage teachers. It will kind of make us keep wanting to do it off the radar. And I know the ESU, or yes, and the Erasmus Student Network, I think perhaps have contested this counting of virtual exchange participants towards mobility. So I mean, I think it's important to count and recognize the experience, but the kind of overload of bureaucracy can be problematic. I have a concern that educators will be pushed in certain directions in the setup of their exchanges. So for national governments and supranational organizations like the European Commission, there are strategic geographic areas, right? So we have the Middle East, Southern Mediterranean, Sweden now has a program with South Africa, Finland has a program with Japan. So there are these kind of strategic interests. Institutions also have strategic partners. So it might be the top ranking universities or certain, universities that are important for the institutions. And they might strongly encourage educators to go for these rather than for other partnerships. So I think it is good that institutions are involved, but I think there needs to kind of be bottom up and top down, because I think otherwise we risk promoting further inequalities and reinforcing certain dynamics, which rather than enriching the ecology of knowledges and engagement with knowledges different from our own, we're actually kind of reinforcing these kind of colonial neoliberal dynamics, imbalances in power, expertise, and funding. And, okay, I get it. Obviously, those with funds call the shots. It's inevitable, but I think as implementers, we can be aware, right? We need to kind of be self-critical and aware of what we're doing and highlight the values of virtual exchange, right? So the whole idea of virtual exchange is that it's based on mutual learning, reciprocity. And this doesn't always happen, right? So if you're funding a training program and you're only training the teachers in whatever country it is, the other partners are not involved, you're starting with a very unequal dynamic, because the point is that it's supposed to be co-designed, right? So these are some of the issues. And then the last issue, that I promise I'll get on to the positive part, is that we risk focusing too much on the soft skills are good, but readiness for the work-based, challenge-based learning, and not giving equal importance to critical interculturality and dialogue-based engagement that isn't always convergent. So we're always doing something. Now we're producing, we're doing projects, make the outputs with tasks and teachers. We have to produce something at the end, but we're not stopping and listening. And one of the things that we found in the research was that students said that they'd never had the kinds of interactions they had in these dialogues. They never spent 2 hours listening and speaking. And I think this is something that, so it's not even a question of virtual online. They weren't even having this in physical spaces. There's always this focus to be productive, and life isn't only about production. So let's go on to the optimism. What I think is really exciting is the great interest and involvement in kind of so-called global south in virtual exchange. So South Africa, for example, is becoming an important actor in virtual exchange, and we're seeing South African institutions providing professional development to prestigious institutions in the global north. And I think that is really important. In Latin America, too, there's a growing number of networks engaging in virtual exchange practices and building South-South collaborations in multiple languages. Language is another issue that I haven't mentioned. The next IVEC conference, for example, will be held in São Paulo in Brazil. So this is, I think, a really exciting development. I was recently talking to some doctoral students who were involved in the VAMOS virtual exchange, and this was one with Sweden, Italy, and Honduras and Brazil. And it was really exciting to hear how they came to understand more about student-centered pedagogy. So the doctoral students were involved with the professor, and they were learning about teaching. They were learning about the benefits of talking to people in regions that they're studying and better understand the impact of the climate crisis on people in the Amazon, because they were actually connecting to people in the Amazon. I've seen people who took part in virtual exchange several years ago. So I don't know if any of the Eve people remember Tarek, who was one of the ambassadors of virtual exchange. And he was in Syria, and he took part in every single opportunity available. So he did all the different kinds of exchanges. He became a facilitator. He did MOOCs. He did all sorts of other online experiences. And with that, really built his language, his skills. He's now studying, he did a crowdfunding campaign. He built his kind of network as well, and is now at King's College doing a master's in global health and social justice, not as a refugee, but as an international student with all the implications of that. So, I mean, and he's one example, but a lot of the people that were engaged through virtual exchange have built networks which have then supported them, those who want to move whatever. Another of the facilitators has now been involved in, he organizes debates in across various African countries. He was more interested in moving south. So there are a lot of really exciting things that have happened. So now that we have a better idea of how to do virtual exchange, we know what the ingredients are that support students' intercultural learning, different kinds of intercultural learning, all of which are important. Now, thanks to Frames, we have a much better idea of how virtual exchange can be integrated in universities' activities and how it can be recognized for students and teachers. We can continue expanding this activity, so both in terms of involving more young people in different models of this activity, tried and tested ones like the Connect program and Sharing Perspectives programs, experimenting with new approaches. But what we mustn't lose sight of is why we're doing it, okay? Why, and our values, and reflecting on these power dynamics. So what I'd like to see is virtual exchange being used to expand the so-called ecology of knowledges, so that we and our students come to understand the situatedness of our knowledge, right? Where it is, why we think the way we do. The histories, how Eurocentric higher education is, and discover that there are also other valid knowledges and experiences out there that we can engage with and learn from and with. And to do this, we can't ignore our histories. We need to start being more reflexive. I'd really like to see non-hegemonic forms of translocal collaboration also involving players outside of academia, many of whom I believe have done better than higher education institutions in their use of technologies to connect people and bring humanity, social, and climate justice into our worlds by building powerful grassroots movements and organizing across the globe. So you think of the Civil Fleet in the Mediterranean, Black Lives Matter, Fridays for Future, whatever. There are a lot of movements who are using technology and building collaborations and network. So I think, a growing ecology of virtual exchange that is reflexive and self-aware, growing but slowly in the cracks of universities' activity, creating a pluriversity of knowledge, humanity, and care. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, for this quite dense and actually inspiring presentation. And I think we had not just evidence-based assessment of previous and ongoing experiences, but even already, I think we had a set of recommendations and main messages. We need to keep searching for a pragmatical approach, realistic, output-oriented attitudes, and above all, we need to spread this message with our colleagues in order to fine-tune these activities and the future application. I think we are approaching the break, but probably we can have a few minutes for comments. But I would like to give priority to the people who are following on remote. I don't know if we have, because I don't see the screen, if we have questions from the audience. In any case, we are open for any comments and questions. Yeah, sure. Yeah, please.
I mean this is one of the points. It's and was it Marcello or Luca mentioned, I think that this is what we focused on very much in the past, and I think this is what brought resistance to virtual exchange, because it's, in particular, those promoting mobility, because it's seen as, because the point is that, you know, we should be aiming for 100% mobility for all, everybody who has the right to, okay? So I think perhaps framing it differently is it's a way of improving and expanding and increasing the diversity of our classrooms. Okay, so instead of comparing it to mobility, it's improving education. It's opening the classroom. So some classes are open international, but not all classes are open international. So in a sense, perhaps we've been banging on the wrong nail. It could be seen as a form of, you know, opening the classroom, expanding education, instead of always putting it in the mobility box, right?
Good morning, and thank you for this beautiful presentation. My question relates to the obstacles that you were pointing out to the idea of expanding virtual exchange or COIL. And I think that what you said about the fact that there is institutional resistance is nowadays very much at the core of those difficulties. In the sense that, as you just said, academics are tired, overload, as we all know in this room. So I'm not going to deal with it a lot. So far, in our experience, and I would like your opinion on that, very often, except for some notable exceptions you were mentioning, such as the Netherlands, people engaging, colleagues engaging in virtual mobility do so because they believe in it. You know, they are the believers, those who see it as a mission. But it doesn't work that way. I mean, the numbers will never expand if you keep on expecting people to do so because they think it's a good way of teaching or contributing to expanding their students' competencies. So in your experience, what could be a way of making sure that the institution is really supportive in terms of recognizing the time that is needed to set up a virtual mobility scheme or incentives, or because without that, I really think that it's going to be, I mean, the numbers are going to stay, you know, very much the same for a long time. I don't want to sound pessimistic, which I'm not by nature.
But I mean, it's true, and I think the frames, I won't answer that. I think frames has a lot of, so Christina's going to be presenting the frames project, and the frames team have a lot of ideas on how the institutions, you know, can support educators in this. I think if we want to think of the students and offer more experiences to the students, as I said, I think having these ready-made, you know, dialogue-based exchanges that external organizations also support, because they can increase. I mean, I'm never going to be able to set up an exchange with 10 different partners, coordinate it, and you know, get them to bring all these people on board and involve large numbers of students. So I do think there is a role for having a portfolio of virtual exchange opportunities for students, some involving teachers, supporting teachers in several ways, but it's going to be very difficult to get a lot of students involved if that is the only model, right? So I think as teachers, and I know a lot of teachers feel threatened by also this model. So I think there is space for a lot of different ways. I think there's also, you know, perhaps lower stakes virtual exchanges. So having, I think with COVID, a lot of people started having guest lecturers, right? So maybe you would bring in a guest lecturer into the class through video, and then from that you can start co-teaching. With Scholars at Risk, Claudia and I teach a students advocacy seminar, And there are students' advocacy seminars in various places coordinated by Scholars at Risk. So it's become a kind of networked seminar. So the students occasionally collaborate with other students in other countries working on the same cases. So it's not an intense dialogue, but it's a kind of loose collaboration. So there will be also, I think, a wider spectrum, if you like, of international, intercultural experiences, which can involve educators slowly. And then from there, you may move on to further things. But then I think we also need dialogue-based, so I think there needs to be both.
Hi, thank you. I would like to add, because what you just said and what you said before in your speech, the way you talked about the integral dialogue, and we've been through them all, through the intercultural dialogue. We started virtual exchange quite early. But the way you said, how can it be that universities invest in software, hardware, furniture, whatever, and they don't do in the dialogues? And there was the moment that I wrote down, we need to get this Francesca in at the year opening and tell our executive board, because that is the whole thing. When the intercultural dialogue started, we thought it was too good to be true. And it was, because it finished.
You were one of the few, yeah.
It was too good to be true, because all the time the teachers lag. And of course, there is some will be scared because there's other people. The thing that needed improvement that time was the quality of the facilitators, because there were really good ones and there were not so good ones. And if there's not so good ones, you lose the teachers, because so, but they were too good to be true, really. So I hope we get there one day. Thank you.
We need, but also the Commission too. I think the way the new Erasmus, the way the new Erasmus Virtual Exchange is organised hasn't made space for it. But we do have the CliveX project. Sorry, I did forget to say that we do have a new one with a limited number of partners, though. So we have a new one on climate movements with Sharing Perspectives and Unimed, but it's for a limited number of universities. So I think one of the problems with the continuation with the Commission is that they didn't take into consideration this idea of different models.
So thank you, Francesca, for the very nice keynote. I think at the institution level, what is also very important is that there's a strong push now from online learning. So also at the European level, you also see that there's the online teaching organizations such as the EADTU are also promoting models of what we would call distance learning, and universities are trying to integrate those into their systems. And this is more like a top-down process, and they think that they need to invest in that rather than just starting this bottom-up, because it's much more tangible. You know that you're doing a project, and so this is done in the university with European partners, and all the partners are involved at a very high level. So this is something I think that's very important. And also, it is very easy if the training is provided by external trainers. You don't have to do it yourself. So what we see is also that most universities like mine have teacher professional development teams, but they're hardly concerned with virtual exchange, because they are now trying to prepare teachers for the next pandemic, so to speak, where they all have to somehow be able to use Zoom, although most of them already know this. And so all of the efforts and all the, also the investments in technology go into that. So virtual exchange is not a very sexy topic in that respect. So it's all about artificial intelligence and those kinds of developments now, where all the investments at the institutions go. So I think we still have a lot of convincing to do at the institutional level before they will actually take over the training, which is now offered centrally by all these organizations. So I think it's very important that we also make a difference at that level. So that is something that I see happening in my university, at least.
Mm-hmm. And I think I didn't mention anything about ed tech companies as well. I mean,
yeah.
Your triggering remark about not using it too much as a functional way for interculturality. I think we also recognize that it's all functional, but it's also very useful, and we must want it. Let's put it that way. But on the other hand, we also realize if we do not explicitate it, we cannot sell it. So there's some how do you call that? Two ways to approach it, I think, and I think we all want it to be as normal a part of education as the internet is now. But we will have to work on that. It's not going to go automatically. So,
Absolutely.
Yes, thanks again for your beautiful speech. I'm also wondering, have we been looking at the Global South and what they are doing? Because in the exchanges I've done with Latin America, for example, I'm all the time so surprised how they have implemented COIL coordinators and how they quickly come up with partners. And I don't know, I haven't heard about studies looking into universities in that part of the world and how they have integrated virtual exchange. So do you know anything?
I met some people at the IVEC conference, and some people are presenting. I mean, the Teletandem project that was in language teaching, they've been doing that for ages, since 2006. That was very much in language teaching and was about interactions. But no, I mean, I'm not in a good position to say how much they're doing, what they're doing, but they are definitely growing. And they're also talking about South Africa and Latin America kind of building these South-South dialogues as well, so that they seem to be kind of working towards that as well. But it's
but there's
really
growing
engaged
there
the
seems
voice.
to be a growing market there.
It's really growing there, because they're saying at last they feel, they can take part in the conversation on more equal terms. And I think also, with COVID, it's, these helicopter researchers landing in there, extracting the data, taking it out and writing up the papers. It's enabled them to say, okay, you're not coming here. It would change the terms of the conversation, right? So it can create a more equal dynamics. And I think they've seen that.
And maybe the necessity is higher because there's even less students going abroad from Latin American countries or, other global
There's definitely mobility, and I'm sure a lot is being, in fact, in thinking of the Teletandem, a lot of the research has been published in Portuguese, so also they're publishing in Spanish and Portuguese. Yeah, it's not a business. Yeah, exactly. It's not part of neoliberal higher education, because it's not. I mean, it can be used for marketing, but.
I just wanted to add to this, because we are coming as three from the University of Girona, and we collaborate a lot with South American institutions where actually they help us, because we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the infrastructures, and they often give training for the tandems, the collaborations. And I always, encourage our lecturers to partner with institutions that have more experience than us. And they do much more than us. So in our case, it's very beneficial also because of the language. Not all our lecturers speak fluent English or feel like engaging in that way. And we found a space where they also speak Spanish. And so it's really, and they're far ahead from a lot of us, with infrastructures and stuff as well.
Can I say something, Francesca? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Talking about Latin America, in 19th centuries, they were successful in revolution better than European countries. Probably they are opening a new dimension. I come back to my concept of how to involve leadership in this perspective, because the topic for me, listening Francesca, is how to involve educators to consider virtual exchange part of their academic life, the daily academic life. This is the most difficult things, because if you look at internationalization, forget for a moment virtual exchange. Our teachers, our professors in universities are surely familiar with Erasmus mobility. okay? The European Erasmus Mobility, ESN. Once we move to Erasmus ICM, International Credit Mobility, students that can come from Southern Mediterranean, Western Balkan, Latin America, I don't know, whatever. This become a little more different because they complain about the lack of languages or academic path and so on. And this creates some obstacles to their own daily life because they have to talk to those students, then the examination, evaluation, blah, 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 and so on. If you look at the international cooperation dimension, it's less relevant for an academics because why I have to do that? I'm not evaluated for what I do in international cooperation activity. I'm evaluated for my research, not for doing a project in Tunisia. And look, I know that he's a crazy guy because do things like that. But how to involve, how to convince academics to be part of. And they do that or because they have a feel that is important to do, or because they have their attitude to internationalization, or because the university, again, believe that internationalization is part of the relevance activity and so on. Otherwise, and this is the UNIMED perspective, is very difficult to involve academics in international projects if we are not talking about research, of course.
Yeah.
If these become part of the social responsibility of the universities, and we will be able to evaluate, to guarantee a sort of plus for those that are involved in this path, I think that we will succeed, I don't know, but at least we will be able to pass a message. And then, little by little, this could become, as the Erasmus mobility scheme, the European and so on dimension, as a sort of part of our daily life, normal life. And once you will probably, our professors, academics, see that this is important in terms of value, in terms of feedback that they receive, I think that they will continue to do that, because at the end of the day, it's not something in terms of daily work, some very difficult at the end. Technology is there. It's not a matter of technology, instruments and infrastructure. It's not only a topic of competencies and so on. The most difficult thing is volunteer. And we have to encourage in some way this volunteer. And university leaders, this is the reason why I ask the rectors to be consider these, and not only these, we are discussing about how to welcome more refugees and migrants in universities. This is another issue, why we have to do that and blah, 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 and so on. If it's part of social responsibility, and we are asking also to the Italian National Agency for Evaluation to give a value to this, refugees, virtual exchange, and so on, to be measured and to encourage university to do that. And not only the university in itself, but also, again, the academics. Thanks, again.
Totally agree.
Yes, may I just, I didn't want to intervene, but the discussion is too interesting. I mean, it is especially discussing in these 2 years of frames with other international colleagues, it is especially a matter of criteria, at least in Italy, criteria of recruiting researchers, professors, and so on, and also career development. Because I know a lot of professors, not researchers, professors that never were in international activities. That's, you are lucky if they speak Italian, just to be exaggerated. So no English word, no foreign language knowledge, just nothing. And they are paid by the Minister of University and Research. So I think strategically speaking, we need to push at the ministry level to change or to revise criteria for recruiting and career development progression of our teaching staff, because we need to have someone that at different levels, PhD students, researchers, professors, and whatever, are at least familiar with internationalization and with other culture, because we have, believe me, a lot of Italian professors that are very far from this issue. So when you propose them to do also a very small international activities, 2 credits, three credits, why? I'm not paid for that. I'm not evaluated for that. So,
But, you know, I say that too now, even with the BIPs, because with all the administrative work, with all the other teaching we have to do, with the criteria, you know, for the abilitazione, it's purely publications. Teaching doesn't count. So it's not, it's international and it's teaching. It doesn't count.
And public engagement even less.
And in public engagement, even less. So it's teaching and public engagement together that don't count towards the career.
I just want to play the role of
Devil's advocate.
you know, although I'm not chairing, is it? I would propose, since we have, well, we have 3 panels and 2 of them are really related to these points, institutionalization, accreditation, whatever, and sustainability. And then, of course, the first panel in the afternoon will be on strategy of internationalization. If we don't have specific points on Francesca's presentation, I would go for the break because we are a little bit late.